Chp-2-Back at Kirrin Cottage. Julian, Dick, and George and Timmy went straight away to have buns and ginger beer at the station cafe. It was good to be all together again. Timmy went nearly mad with joy at seeing the two boys. He kept trying to get onto their knees. "Look, Timmy, I love you very much and I'm really glad to see you," said Dick, "but that's twice you've spilt my ginger beer all over me." "Has he behaved himself this term, George?" "Quite well," said George, considering. "Hasn't he, Anne?" "I mean, he only got a joint of meat out of the larder once, and he didn't do so much harm to that cushion he chewed, and if people will leave their wellies all over the place nobody can blame Timmy for having a good old game with them." "And that was the end of the wellies, I suppose," said Julian, with a grin. "On the whole, Timmy, you have a bad report." "I'm afraid Uncle Quentin won't award the usual pocket money we get for good reports." "You," at the mention of her father, George scowled. "I see George hasn't lost her pretty scowl," said Dick, in a teasing voice. "We wouldn't know her unless she put on that scowl half a dozen times a day." "Oh, she's better than she was," said Anne, hurrying to George's defense at once. George wasn't as touchy as she had once been when she was being teased. All the same, Anne knew that there might be sparks flying over her father taking Kirrin Island these holidays, and she didn't want George to fly into a temper too soon. Julian looked at his cousin. "You're not going to take this business of Kirrin Island too much to heart, are you?" he said. "You've just got to realize that your dad's a really clever man, one of the best scientists we've got, and I think that those kind of men ought to be allowed as much freedom as they like, for their work. I mean, if Uncle Quentin wants to work on Kirrin Island for some peculiar reason of his own, then you ought to be pleased to say, 'Go ahead, Dad.'" George looked a little mutinous after this long speech, but she respected Julian, and usually went by what he said. He was older than any of them, a tall, good-looking boy, with determined eyes and a strong chin. George scratched Timmy's head and spoke in a low voice. "All right. I won't go up in smoke about it, Julian. But I'm very disappointed. I'd planned to go to Kirrin Island ourselves these holidays." "We're all disappointed," said Julian. "Hurry up and finish your bun. We've got to get across London and catch the train for Kirrin. We'll miss it if we're not careful." Soon they were in the train for Kirrin. Julian was very good at getting taxis, and gazed admiringly at her big brother as he found them all corner seats in any hurrying carriage. Julian always knew how to manage things. "Do you think I've grown, Julian?" she asked him. "I did hope I'd be as tall as George by the end of this term, but she grew too, as Touchy has said. All the flying over YS, and I think you're a bit taller than last term, said Julian. You can't catch us up, and you'll always be the smallest. But I like you small. Look at Timmy, putting his head out of the window. You've as usual, said Dick. Timmy, you'll get grit in your eye. Then George'll go mad with grief and think you're going blind. That was the nice thing about Timmy. He always knew when he was being spoken to, even if his name, say, Go, wasn't mentioned, and he answered at once. His long Aunt Fanny was at the station at Kirrin to meet them in the pony cart. The children flung themselves on her, for they were very fond of her. She was kind and gentle, and did her best to keep her clever, impatient husband from finding too much fault with the children. How's Uncle Quentin? Asked Julian, politely, when they were setting off in the trap. He's very well, said his aunt. And very excited. Really, I've never known him to be as thrilled as he has been lately. His work has been coming along very successfully. I suppose you don't know what his latest experiment is, said Dick. Oh no. He never tells me a word, said Auntie Ranny. He never tells anyone anything while he's at work. Except his colleagues, of course. But I do know it's very important, and I know, of course, that the last part of the experiment has to be made in a place where there's deep water all around. Don't ask me why. I don't know. Look. There's Kirrin Island, said Anne, suddenly. They had rounded a corner, and had come in sight of the bay. Guarding the entrance to it was the little island topped by the old ruined castle. The sun shone down on the blue sea, and the island looked magical. George looked earnestly at it. She was looking for the building, whatever it was, that her father said he needed for his work. Everyone looked at the island, seeking the same thing. They saw it easily enough. Rising from the center of the castle, probably from the castle yard, was a tall thin tower, rather like a lighthouse. At the top was a glass-enclosed room, which glittered in the sun. Oh, Mum. I don't like it. It spoils Kirrin Island, said George, in dismay. It can come down when your dad has finished his work, said her mother. It's a very flimsy, temporary thing. It can easily be pulled down. Dad promised me he'd scrap it as soon as his work was done. He says you can go across and see it, if you like. It's really interesting. Oh, I'd love to go and see it, said Anne, at once. It looks so strange. Is Uncle Quentin all alone on Kirrin Island, Aunt Fanny? Yes, I don't like him to be alone, said her aunt. For one thing, I'm sure he doesn't get his meals properly. And for another, I'm always afraid some harm might come to him when he's experimenting, and if he's alone, how would I know if anything happened to him? Aunt Fanny, You could always arrange for him to signal to you each morning and night, couldn't you? Said Julian, sensibly. He could use that tower easily. He could flash a signal to you in the morning, using a mirror, heliographing that he was all right, and at night he could signal with a torch. Easy. Yes. I did suggest that sort of thing, said his aunt. I said I'd go over with you all tomorrow to see him, and perhaps, Julian, you could arrange something of the sort with your uncle? He seems to listen to you now. Do you mean to say Dad wants us to invade his secret lair, and actually to see his strange tower? Asked George, surprised. Well, I don't think I want to go. After all, it's my island, and it's horrible to see someone else in charge of it. Oh, George, don't start all that again, said Anne, with a sigh. You and your island. Can't you even lend it to your own dad? Aunt Fanny, you should have seen George when your letter came. She looked so fierce that I was quite scared. Everyone laughed except George and Aunt Fanny. She looked upset. George was always so difficult. She found fault with her father, and argued with him time after time, but how very, very like him she was, with her scowls, her sudden temper, and her fierceness. If only George was as sweet-tempered and as easy-going as these three cousins of hers. George looked at her mother's troubled face, and felt ashamed of herself. She put her hand on her knee. It's all right, Mum. I won't make a fuss. I'll try and keep my feelings to myself, really I will. I know Dad's work is important. I'll go with you to the island tomorrow. Julian gave George a gentle nudge. George, you've actually learned to give in gracefully. You're more like a boy than ever when you act like that. George liked Julian to say she was like a boy, but was indignant. It isn't only boys that can learn to give in gracefully, and things like that, she said. Just as many girls do. Stop arguing now, all of you, said Aunt Fanny, smiling. Here's Kirrin Cottage. Doesn't it look lovely with all the primroses in the garden? And the wallflowers coming out, and the daffodils everywhere? It certainly did. The four children and Timmy tore in at the front gate, delighted to be back. They clattered into the house, and, to their great delight, found Joanna, the cook, there. She'd come back to help for the holidays. She beamed at the children, and fondled Timmy when he leapt around her barking. Haven't you all grown? Julian, you're taller than I am. And you're getting quite big. That pleased Anne, of course. Julian went back to the front door to help his aunt with the bags. Julian and Dick took everything upstairs and joined them, eager to see her old bedroom again. Oh, How good it was to be in Kirrin Cottage once more. She looked out of the windows. One looked onto the moor at the back. The other looked sideways onto the sea. Lovely! Lovely! She began to sing a little song as she undid her bag. You know, she said to Dick, when he brought George's bag in, you know, Dick, I'm quite glad that Uncle Quentin has gone to Kirrin Island, even if it means we won't be able to go there much. I feel much freer in the house when he's away. He's a very clever man and he can be very nice, but I always feel a bit afraid of him. Dick laughed. I'm not afraid of him, but he's a bit of a wet blanket in the house, I agree, when we're here for the holidays. Funny to think of him on Kirrin Island all alone. A voice came up the stairs. Come down to tea, children, because there are hot scones for you, just out of the oven. Coming. Aunt Fanny, called Dick. Hurry up. Anne. I'm starving. Julian, did you hear Aunt Fanny calling? George came up the stairs to fetch Anne. She was pleased to be home, and as for Timmy, he was busy going around every single corner of the house, sniffing vigorously. He always does that, said George. As if he thought that there might be a chair or a table that didn't smell the same as it always did. Come on, Tim. Tea time. Mum, as Dad isn't here, can Timmy sit beside me on the floor? He's very well behaved now. All right, said her mother, and tea began. What a tea! It looked as if it was a spread for a party of 20. Joanna must have baked all day. Well, there wouldn't be much left when the 5 had finished.